and I asked her what's wrong. And she looked up at me and she started sobbing. I was generally a really good kid growing up because I was scared to break the rules. I was the youngest of 3, but I remember this one time that I hurt my mom so much I made her cry. I was 13 years old and I had gotten my braces off and replaced it with retainers that I was supposed to wear every single day. And as a kid, I didn't really take responsibility very well. So during lunch one day, I took my retainers off and I was chatting with my friends, eating our soggy pizza and drinking chocolate milk. And afterwards, I took my tray and threw it away. Everything was fine. After school, I went home. And then I realized I didn't have my retainers. And I remembered that I had wrapped my retainers in a little ball of Kleenex and I put it on my lunch tray and I must have accidentally thrown it all away. So I was so scared to tell my mom this because at that point it was a goner. There was no way that I would be able to find them. So I had to tell her because she would have noticed if I wasn't wearing my retainers. So I said, Mom, I lost my retainers and I think I accidentally threw them away. And this was just 1 week after getting the new set of retainers after my braces came off. We weren't rich by any means, and so the financial aspect of it was something that I felt very guilty about. I knew that it would cost money, and I knew that it was my fault for not taking better care of my retainers. To my surprise, my mom didn't yell and she wasn't super angry. She just said, okay, we'll go get a replacement, it's okay. So we went to my orthodontist, and my orthodontist was one that my mom picked specifically because they spoke Chinese. They spoke Mandarin. Even though our native tongue is Cantonese, my mom also speaks Mandarin fluently, and she liked this orthodontist because they were bilingual. They could speak English with me and also Chinese to her so that I didn't have to be translating back and forth. So we went to see the orthodontist and she told us that they would have to do a remold of my entire set of teeth and it would cost extra money, of course. I forget how much it was, but it was pretty substantial for us at the time. I think it was maybe about $300 something. And so when it was time for us to check out with the receptionist, my mom asked if there was any discount or anything that they could do to help. And the receptionist was also bilingual. The entire office was, so we really liked them. The receptionist then responded in English and said, "Tch." The receptionist then looked at my mom and scoffed, and she said in English, "We don't offer discounts here," in a very disgusting way. And my mom was kind of taken aback because she sensed the tone even though she didn't understand what the receptionist was saying. So my mom turned to me and she didn't say anything, but her eyes said it all. She wanted me to translate because she wasn't understanding. And I sheepishly walked up and just told my mom, "Can we just pay it? There's no discounts," in Chinese. And she looked at me with these piercing eyes and I felt instantly guilty for saying that. She didn't say anything to me in response, but she turned to the receptionist and asked if she could speak with the orthodontist. So the orthodontist came out and she was a younger woman, but she was also bilingual. She spoke Chinese fluently because up until now, we had always come in and she would speak Chinese to my mom. She was very pleasant and respectful. But when she came out this time, for some reason, she refused to speak in Chinese, almost as if she was pretending like she didn't know Chinese at all. And she told my mom, "We don't offer discounts here, that's the price and you're going to have to pay it." And my mom asked her in Chinese if she could speak in Chinese so that she could better understand. And the orthodontist looked at my mom with no expression on her face and she proceeded to speak in English. "We don't offer discounts here. That's the price you're going to pay." In that moment, I felt so embarrassed. As a kid, I didn't really know what to do. And I told my mom in Chinese, "Just pay it. That's the price. There's no discount." My mom eventually, of course, paid the bill and then we left. The orthodontist then rolled her eyes and turned around and walked away without saying goodbye or anything to my mom. Now, in that moment, I remember being genuinely so confused because I was wondering why the receptionist and the orthodontist didn't speak Chinese, even though my mom was pleading with them to speak Chinese to her so that she could understand. And I really didn't understand why they weren't speaking Chinese because I knew they spoke it fluently. That's how we communicated all along throughout the past 2 years that I had braces. So in this instance, I was so confused at why they were speaking English to her and responding in English, even though my mom was asking if they could please speak Chinese to her like they normally do. Fast forward to now, many years later as an adult, and I reflect on that, I realize that that was a power dynamic that the orthodontist and the receptionist was trying to play against my mom. Because my mom didn't speak English, they knew that they had the upper hand, and it almost was their way of embarrassing her and belittling her. And it makes me feel so guilty and sick to my stomach to this day, because I still remember the looks on their faces when they were intentionally responding in English, knowing very well that my mom didn't understand anything they were saying and that they spoke Chinese fluently. And it just makes me feel so sad to think that the only reason why my mom chose that orthodontist was because she felt more at home and because she felt like she could communicate with them and that she would be supported in that way as a customer. So we get home, and on the drive home, it was complete silence. My mom didn't yell, she didn't say anything. I was too scared to say anything, but I had all these thoughts racing through my mind, and I was still so confused as to why the orthodontist wasn't speaking in Chinese to my mom. So we got home, and I remember it was just starting to get dark, and we didn't have any of the lights on yet. So my mom walks upstairs where she has her desk, and behind her desk was the door to my room. And I remember just walking up after her, seeing her sit down at her desk, and she just sat down like this with her hands over her forehead. And I walked into my room. I really didn't know what to do, but I knew that she was upset and I didn't really know how to approach it. So I decided to work up my courage, and I walked out to her and stood in front of her at her desk. It was still dark, and it was getting even darker now. There were no lights on. And I asked her what's wrong. And she looked up at me and she started sobbing. And she said in Chinese, "Am I that embarrassing to you? Am I so embarrassing because I don't speak English? Because I couldn't communicate with them? Because I just wanted to ask the question of whether they could give a little discount or not? Am I so embarrassing to you?" And I felt so terrible at that moment, because I knew that the one person that she could rely on in that office, which was me, I didn't show up for her. And I actually sided with the orthodontist and the receptionist, and I urged her to just stop asking questions and to just pay the damn bill, because I was so embarrassed. And I felt so guilty of that in that moment. Here she was, my mom, who sacrificed everything, moving from Hong Kong to the United States to provide a better life for myself and my two siblings. And we assimilated into American culture. We grew up here, we speak English, we ate McDonald's, we ate Taco Bell, and that's what my parents wanted. And yet there was this big conflict between us and this big culture divide, because our roots are Chinese and our roots are from Hong Kong. But we grew up here in the United States, and there's this certain sense of shame that comes about with immigrant parents who didn't assimilate enough and adapt to the local language. And the gap between them and their children becomes further and further apart as they get older. And that's what I was feeling in that moment, because I was so guilty. Even though I could easily have translated in English and in Cantonese, I chose not to. I chose to do exactly what the orthodontist and the receptionist was doing. And it brought so much embarrassment for my mom, and it made her feel so disappointed and belittled, because we were using the one thing against her that she couldn't change. We were using the one weakness that she always knew about herself ever since moving here, which was that she never fully learned to speak English fluently. And she never fully felt confident and comfortable speaking in English because of those situations that she's encountered at the supermarket or at the bank, when people would rush her and say, "Don't you understand me?" And that made her shut down. And in that moment at that orthodontist office, I did the exact same thing of what all these Americans were doing to her. And for that, I feel so sad that on that day I didn't show up for my mom. And when I think back on this story, it brings back a flood of emotions for me, because it really just highlights how difficult and how complex it is when we have immigrant families and immigrant parents raising children, in a different place, in a different environment. And it almost creates this disconnect between the family members, one that is so hard to undo and so hard to avoid. And that was such a great learning moment for me, because at that point in my life, as a teenager, a young teenager, I wasn't proud of my culture and I wasn't proud to be Asian. And I actually tried to hide those parts of me because I was so desperately trying to fit in to the American culture. And I was so desperately trying to fit in with most of my other peers that I wanted to erase parts of my identity and I wanted to hide parts of my identity. But now as an adult, I am so proud that I have a rich culture, and I'm so proud that I come from Hong Kong and I have family there and I have roots there. And I just sometimes wish that I had spent more time in my younger years asking questions and learning from my ancestors, even those that have passed, my grandma, my grandparents, and just learning from them and understanding what their experience was, so that I could have more of these stories and experiences that I can then pass on to my niece, my nephews, and have them remember the importance of knowing who you are and where you come from. And I think the big learning here for me is the importance of knowing who you are. And this actually turned out to be one of the greatest leadership lessons for me, because my mom is a leader. And despite being in a completely foreign environment, having to learn an entirely new way of life, raise children single-handedly in a new place without speaking the language, that is true leadership. She led us and our family to thrive in this new world. And even though there were things working against her, she never let that bring her fully down to where she wasn't constantly moving forward. And that is a true sign of a leader. Those are qualities of a leader where you have resilience despite changes and despite surprises and despite how other people may treat you. You have resilience and you have grit. And that is exactly what my mom instilled in me. So when I think back on this story and just imagine the feelings she was probably feeling inside, especially when she started sobbing in front of me and asking me why I felt so embarrassed to have her as a mom, someone who doesn't even speak English. That is an important leadership lesson on character, on integrity, and something that I will never forget. And those qualities of having integrity and having strong character and grit and resilience are things that I still carry with me day in and day out throughout my entire career. And as I look into the future, I know that instilled in me are these strong qualities from my mom, who was and is still a very strong leader and someone that I really admire. So I dedicate this video to my mom. I'm sure she doesn't even remember this story at all, but this is one of those stories that I just remember so vividly. And as I was walking through it just now, I felt all those emotions.